Hey, welcome to another Uncommon Pursuit event. My name is Carson Whitenauer, and today I am doing a deep dive interview with Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. I probably like you, get so frustrated with all of the spam and low quality pseudo experts and clickbait headlines and viral memes. And I just crave a deep dive conversation with a true expert. And Dr. Pryor is that. She is a very popular speaker and author. She's a columnist with Religion News Service. She's written for the New York Times and the Washington Post and Vox and Christianity Today and other big name organizations that I've forgotten to mention. And today we're going to have a very rich, empathetic, thoughtful conversation about her new book, The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. And for me, this is something I don't hear talked about very much, the stories and images and metaphors of evangelicalism. I'm used to talk about sin and righteousness, God's providence, faithfulness and faith, church growth strategies, but a literature analysis, a literary analysis from someone who has spent their career assessing how story and image and metaphor work. This was eye-opening for me, and I think it's going to be eye-opening for you as well. I hope if you're not an evangelical, you're going to understand evangelicals a little bit better after listening to this. If you are an evangelical like I am, you might understand yourself better. But ultimately, I hope that this just breaks open your mind and you're able to see God more clearly because of this conversation. So, Dr. Pryor, this is our second conversation together. We did one on a whole pro-life ethic after Roe v. Wade was overturned. I'm so glad to have you back, and welcome back to an Uncommon Pursuit event. So I wanted to ask you to explain why you chose to talk about what you chose to talk about. Why talk about story, image, and metaphor? I mean, this sounds like a graduate English class. Why do you think people need to pay attention to story, image, and metaphor in order to understand evangelicalism?
It's great to be back with you, Carson. Thank you. That is a great question. And in some ways, the book does draw on my decades of teaching, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And the work that I try to do here is kind of the work that I do in all of my books, and that is to kind of be a translator to a general audience of some of the scholarly work that's out there and some of the art and culture that maybe people outside the college classroom don't get to engage with, and yet we are being influenced by it all the time. We might not think about metaphor very much unless we're like in a freshman English class, and we might not think about the images and stories that surround us, but they influence our imagination so much. In fact, what I do is I draw on an idea by the renowned philosopher Charles Taylor, of the social imaginary. It's a philosophical term. I don't use it in the title, but that's really what I'm talking about. And all that is a way of describing the way we in communities, in societies, have sort of a collective pool of unexamined, assumed sort of visions for the good life or expectations or stories or metaphors that we might not even really be thinking about, but they're just there. We've inherited them from our social and cultural traditions. The American dream is a great example of that. If you live in America, we have this idea of the American dream that's sort of shaping us and guiding us and setting our expectations, whether we think about it or not. And evangelicals have their own social imaginaries. And the movement it didn't just begin in the 20th century or the 21st century, it began in the 18th century. And we have all of that history and all those traditions and all those ideas that are part of our DNA that we don't necessarily think about. And so I just kind of try to identify the key elements of our collective imaginary and talk about where they started, why they're there, how they're good, and maybe where they've gone astray.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I enjoyed the footnotes. I'm weird like that, but it's so richly researched and is clearly a labor of love. I was thinking about a different title for your book. You may want to run this by the publisher. Five powerful metaphors to supercharge your faith today. I feel like that would fit better with your target audience. But you went with a darker title, A Culture in Crisis. And I wanted to ask why. And I mean, obviously, your book is coming out tomorrow. By the time this is on YouTube, it's already out and available for purchase. But why a culture in crisis? And especially, I want to deepen the question, make it a little harder maybe, because you're saying it goes back to the 18th century. So, okay, we have colonialism and all the oppression in colonialism. We have the barbarism of American slavery. We have the terror of lynching and Jim and Jane Crow. I could go on and on and on with, sexism and the oppression of women and denigrating them. There's so much we could go into here. Why are you saying we're in a culture of crisis today? Are you critiquing all 200 years, 300 years of evangelicalism, or is there something about the current moment you want to draw our attention to?
Yeah, so there really is something about the current moment, and it's not to say that other people haven't seen this and other people haven't been pointing it out, but I think for me and for my target audience who have had a pretty good experience in evangelicalism. I mean, I still consider myself an evangelical, but at this moment we are seeing, you alluded to this, we're seeing the very definition of evangelicalism being questioned. We're seeing other people reject the title just because of all the connotations that it has now as a result of politics and a result of our sort of facing some of these things that you talked about that are part of our history. And so part of this has been opened up by digital media, because we've all been able to, even if we're evangelical, we've been able to be part of sort of our own insulated communities in our church communities or our local communities, and what might be happening to other people now or in history we might not have had to face or confront or even be aware of. But the digital world is connecting all of us. And so we are seeing a crisis of sexual abuse and cover-up of abuse. We're seeing a crisis of abuse of power. We're seeing a crisis of racism, which of course has been there all along, but most of us aren't able to avoid recognizing it and facing it right now. And so this is kind of the gift that digital media has given us and the global village. But it also does feel like a crisis because there's so little we can do about it. There's a lot we can do, but we often feel helpless and we don't know what the best thing to do about it is. And we can feel like a sense of information overload. But if we're part of this community, I think one of the first steps is just sort of looking at, well, how did we get here? Because I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I do want to throw out the bathwater. And that's sort of a driving metaphor for what this book is trying to do, is to say, okay, so what part is the baby that we want to keep, and what part is the bathwater that's just the cultural baggage that really isn't Christian, but just as part of whether it's American culture or Victorian culture or whatever culture it might be.
Yeah, I think that was an insight that I hope to hold on to. I'm a forgetful person, but I hope to hold on to this insight that when you just say, like, there's a problem with our culture, it's hard to grab onto that and know, well, what part of the culture are you referring to? And if you say racism, yeah, that's horrible. It deforms people's lives and communities, and it's not right. But now, how do I identify it? How do I change it? And the way you explained, well, you look at language. And by understanding the words and the concepts and the metaphors and the images and the stories, you can get specific and you can grab a hold of, aha, here's where there's a problem. And now we can choose another option. And it gives you that awareness that you have to have in order to begin to take a new kind of action, to imagine a new future. So I thought that was incredibly helpful. I wanted to ask a personal question. So you're an evangelical, I'm an evangelical. I think you have a lot more evangelical street cred than I have. But how did this book change you? Because to look at the evangelical imagination is to look at Karen's imagination. So how did this affect you in studying and researching and writing this book?
Oh, no one's asked me that question in all the interviews I've done. Thank you, Carson. That's a weighty one. Sort of on a superficial intellectual level, I learned a lot writing this book. I learned a lot that other people already know, things that have already been written about and researched by scholars. For example, in my chapter on empire, I learned a lot of connections between evangelicals and the Republican Party that go back for decades, well back into the 20th century, that I didn't know about, and the kind of language that was used of empire and bringing a marriage between one political party and the evangelical movement that, again, others wrote about and knew, but our memories are so short in a digital age anyway, because what happened, last week is old news, let alone what happened in the 1950s. One of the things that I write about in the book is that moment when it's been a number of years now, but I was still a mature adult when I learned that the phrase "in God we trust" on our money didn't appear on our currency until the 1950s. And I remember thinking, I thought this was just how it always was, but no, it was a very political kind of
George Washington put this on the court.
Yeah, exactly. And one of my readers who interviewed me a few weeks ago said that she didn't know until she read this book that was the case, and it really, really shook her. So that's a very simple, small thing, but just realizing that so many things were done in a context that is different from what we might have imagined has taught me a lot. That's sort of the superficial thing, but it's also just made me it's made me do what I'm asking readers to do by the end of the book, which is really to seek and find Jesus underneath all of this. And for some of us, what that looks like will look differently. I mean, I went through a huge process of transition just in the course of writing this book, being when I started employed by a major evangelical institution, and by the end no longer being employed, in a process that really didn't have anything to do with the writing of the book, but also does have to do with some of the problems that I've identified here. And so I think many of us as evangelicals feel like the ground is shifting underneath us, and we don't know if it's us or the world. Is it me? What's going on? And I think it's helpful to have a historical perspective, which I tried to bring to this book, and to show that the church has existed for 2,000 years, and it has gone through major shifts, and we may be going through a major shift right now that we might not live to see the end of, or maybe we will. But the church will go on, and all we need to do, even in this time that's so hard and where everything seems to be changing, is to be found faithful. And that is hard, but others have had it harder before us, and so that gives me some courage and perspective.
Yeah, and I think where your book can help, that's one of the ways it helps me is, how to put this, that when the people you trusted prove not to be trustworthy, or when something you've been told is God's will turned out to be really damaging, and you say, if it was God's will for me to be damaged like that, then that affects my relationship with God. And now I'm not just angry at the person, I'm angry at God, because this has all been attributed to him. And your book is saying, well, they said that, and maybe they said it sincerely or maybe maliciously, but actually they were just telling you what Victorians did. And it's like, oh, well, okay, now I can blame the Victorians, but I don't have to blame God for this. And it's, it's frustrating, and it's disillusioning to realize that someone said this is from God, and they, however it came about, they were teaching what Victorians taught. But at least I know that now, and now I have some choice about where I go from there.
Yeah, I mean, so of course I'm pinpointing the Victorian age because that is the age that that was really influenced by the evangelical movement as it was rising and continues to influence us. And so that was kind of the origin of the book, is teaching Victorian literature in an evangelical classroom. And my students saying, wait a minute, this is how I was raised. I was taught this was evangelicalism, and it's really just Victorian. And just encouraging them to say, well, let's look at what the Bible says and separate that out. But the good news is, or maybe the hard news is, that it's not just the Victorians and it's not just evangelicals. I mean, human beings exist in culture. We exist in different times and places, and God designed it that way because he could have just had us skip this whole part on earth and had us, skip right to eternity with him. But he designed it so that we are on this earth, that we are in this fallen world, and we exist in different times and places, and we are influenced by different cultures, that we create culture. And the task for all Christians in all times and all places is to distinguish what is cultural from what is Christian. And culture is good. It's part of God's design. It's not all good, but it's not all bad either. And we have to recognize it's really just part of being human. And that is how we are being grown and sanctified in the Lord as individuals and as a church, is to exist in these cultures and yet to still glorify God and to point to Christ rather than culture.
Yeah, and there are times when I'm more in a burn it all down state of mind, and other times where I'm feeling very grateful for the gifts of our culture. I mean, if it wasn't for our culture, we couldn't have this conversation. There's a technological reality in our culture that enables it, and wow, how grateful I am for that. So before we get into some of the specific metaphors you cover, and maybe this is a bridge to that, I wanted to ask if you could give us some, let's say after reading the book, we want to start becoming more proficient in identifying the metaphors and images and stories that shape our culture. I'm wondering if you could help us get underneath the book a little bit and explain how you picked these particular metaphors and how you saw them. And particularly, I think the problem is blind spots. Because, for instance, my whole life, I've been taught about the story of David and Goliath. And it wasn't until I took a course in my DMin degree where we actually looked at the story as a work of Hebrew storytelling, and we understood how they constructed stories, that I learned that this is part of a cycle of stories about David and Saul. And Goliath is challenging David and Saul equally in the story, but the story is really about who's the rightful king of Israel, David or Saul. And I was like, whoa, I thought this was about David and Goliath. And yeah, okay, it is, but it's really about David and Saul. But once I had the framing, it's about David and Goliath, I couldn't see that it wasn't that. And I couldn't see Saul, and I couldn't see that I didn't see Saul. I wasn't aware that there was another way to read the story. I never would have thought to consider another way to read this story. And so that's something you address in the book, and I'm wondering, when we can't see what we can't see, how did you begin to see what you see in this book?
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is such a great question, such a great introduction to the question, and such a great example that you draw on from your own life and reading the Bible, because we do read in community, including the Bible, and so there's that slant. I've even noticed, there's so much I want to say in response to this. I'll try to rein myself in, but pay attention to this. If you spend any time on social media, okay, so I spend too much time there, but if any of you out there do, and you notice, say, an article or something being tweeted or shared, the first time you see it, your opinion of it will be shaped by whatever that person who tweeted it said. And you'll just see it that way. And I mean, again, I don't know how, and then, or even like on Facebook, if the first person to make sort of a comment and set the tone, the rest of it will mostly follow that. And you can see a different person pointing out something different, and the whole thing goes down a different path. We're very easily it's like we human beings in our minds are like little rudders, and all it takes is for one little turn to one direction, and the whole thing will go in that direction, unless something sort of intentionally or dramatically interrupts it. I don't know if that made any sense or not, but we are very easily, our perspective is very easily framed or directed in one way. It's just, again, it's part of being human. So the way I started this book and sort of set out is to just sort of start with what makes evangelicals different within all of Christendom and all of the iterations and denominations and movements within the church's history. And we do have a very well-respected church historian, David Bebbington, who sort of has given the most widely accepted definition of evangelicalism. And I talk about that in the book. It's the Bebbington Quadrilateral. And he says evangelicals, from the beginning across, modern British and American history have been defined by four qualities: the centrality of the crucifixion, the centrality of the Bible as God's authority, the centrality of the conversion experience, and the emphasis on activism. And I think most people who call themselves, or others would call evangelicals, fit that in some way or another. And those are different emphases than you'll find in other elements of Christianity. And so I started with that. I didn't necessarily cover all those, but I also, on the other end, I started with, as I said before, what I was seeing in the culture around me, like with my students. And so one prominent thing that is part of evangelical subculture today is purity culture, right? This teaching, this connection of our future happiness and holiness and marriage and success with remaining sexually pure, which really is not biblical at all. We are to obey God in our sexual ethics and our sexual lives, but there's no guarantee that will bring happiness. There's no guarantee that will bring a better marriage. And it also does not mean that people who lose their sexual purity by no choice of their own lose any of their holiness. So that message has just, got something that is good to obey God's sexual moral teaching, has gotten distorted and applied in a lot of ways. And we see that a lot in Victorian literature. And so, namely the double standard that is in a lot of Victorian literature, whereby a woman who is not a virgin is ruined, and a man who is not a virgin is okay. And so the conversations that my students would have around this, not just in the classroom but in my office, they have been devastated by the wrong application of teaching about biblical sexuality. And that is very much a part of culture. So I took the things that were part of history, and I took the things that I'm seeing that are sort of emerging as a crisis now, and tried to identify what I think are sort of the major things that define evangelicalism across history and today, for good and ill.
Yeah, and I think just what people will gain from going through the book is, if you get enough practice examples of seeing how you identify it, you start to pick up the tools. And so one of the things my ear is sensitive to, as you were sharing that example, is, okay, the headline under the book or the back cover is, how God will give you an amazing sex life. And so now I'm primed, like, okay, this is from God and it's going to be amazing. All I need to do is open the book and read the verses and put them into practice and click where I'm going to have, prosperity here. And to take a second and say, wait a second, I just need some self-awareness. What got awakened in me when I read that promise? And is that promise true? I want it to be true, but is it true? And do I want to go down the emotional path that the conversation this person is starting with their social media post or with their book? I think just taking a moment to pause and be aware of where I'm being led, that could at least help me in some circumstances.
And it's often as much what's unsaid as what is said. And so an example that I give, that's obviously true when we're talking about, sexual purity. I've had so many conversations with former students who, for whatever reason, had some sort of sin that they committed or was committed upon them, and the miscommunication between them and their parents, like where their parents was, I never said that, I would reject you for this or that, but that's what they thought. That's the message that they heard. A sort of a different example that's not quite so, so sensitive and personal, but still just as powerful, is one I talk about in the book about conversion and testimony. Like evangelicals and I believe that conversion is a biblical idea. We must be born again, each person. That's something that happens to us as individuals. And then we also should be prepared to give an account for our salvation. And so that's the testimony. And it's become our practice over the years, for a number of reasons, to tell our testimony in such a way that we can point to the day, the time, the hour, the year of our salvation. And many stories get told that way, which is perfectly fine. If it's something that's dramatic and you remember, that's wonderful. But what that formula has turned into is something where those like myself who received Jesus at such a young age, I wasn't keeping a day book or a calendar, and nor was my mother, so I didn't have that day and time and hour recorded, is that we get this sort of unstated expectation. Wait a minute, did I really do that? Is my salvation sure? Maybe I better repeat it again or go down the aisle again. And it's not that someone said that, but because they didn't say the opposite of the way the formula goes, it can just become part of a pattern where we think, oh, this is part of what it means to be saved. And it is sometimes, but it's not necessary.
Yeah. So I want to read a quote from your chapter on conversion. You write, evangelicals' long emphasis on conversion, its stadium-filled services, its emotional altar calls, its formulaic prayers of salvation, leaves too little emphasis on formation, on sanctification. Personal salvation alone will not solve all problems, personal and social. Get people saved, one hears constantly, in response to laments about social injustice and moral problems. If this were all that were necessary to eradicate injustice, there would be no, or at least far fewer, Christians who bought and sold slaves, abused their wives, aborted their unborn children, watched porn, or got drunk on power. Woe to us if we fail to see what exactly we are asking people to convert to. So, that just rings true. Whenever there's some kind of big story, if people's hearts and minds were changed by the gospel and people placed their faith in Jesus, this wouldn't happen anymore. You can just predict it. It's click whir. Whenever some social injustice becomes impossible to ignore. And, I think the book is illuminating and showing how insufficient this response is, unless we can go beyond it and say, because a person who has placed their faith in Jesus would speak clearly that this is wrong, and their hearts would be broken for those victimized and devastated by this injustice, and they would, in love, act in a way to relieve the suffering of their neighbor in this crisis. And further, they would apply their wisdom to change the structures and the systems that allowed this to happen in the first place, because they would want to see their neighbors not suffer anymore. Why do you think it is that there's been so much emphasis on the moment of conversion and so much reluctance to have the second half of that message?
Yeah, I think part of it, a big part of it, is that evangelicalism is a product of modernity, and modernity is characterized by an emphasis on reason and rationality and measurable outcomes and technology and methods, things that are easy to quantify. The scientific, mindset, the scientific, formulas. That's all part of the Enlightenment and part of modernity. And I'm so thankful for the things that it brings us, like you said earlier, the technology. But it's still limited. And so, but because evangelicalism is a product of modernity, we have this emphasis, just like moderns do, to count, to calculate, to methodize, to have rubrics and formulas and programs. And those are things that are a lot easier to track. The number of raised hands versus the impossibility. I mean, we can count the number of raised hands, but we cannot count how deeply one person disciples another and how profoundly someone is changed through the process of discipleship. So it's easier. It's part of our modern culture. And it also, it gets more money, right? It's easier to get grants and donations when we can quantify what we do. That's just human too. But we as believers should be, less willing to rely so much on the human, tangible, quantifiable things.
That's really helpful. And I do think that one of the motivating factors, I guess speaking for myself, and if others feel implicated by my confession, they can work that out with God, but is pride. And if you can tell someone, my book has sold this many copies, or we've reached this many people this year, I mean, I feel like my work mattered. It assures me that my ego that, hey, I did something and I can count and see how much I accomplished. And to a certain degree, I mean, I think that's there's some kind of wisdom there, but we need a deeper level of confidence that being faithful to God is enough. And sometimes that results in better outcomes that we can see. And sometimes it results in worse outcomes. But if we try and control those outcomes, we get distracted from faithfulness. And so we need practices that help us just be okay with faithfulness rather than ministries going into the same church and recounting the kids every 3 months as new Christians so they all have good reports at the end of the year.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with counting the things that can be counted, but we shouldn't count those things as worth more than the things that are immeasurable and eternal that can't be counted.
So, Karen, you started off the book on as controversial a topic as you could have with your chapter on awakening. And you start off in a very nice way. This is an archetypal, universal across all cultures. And awakening has always been part of the scriptures and of evangelicalism. And I'm just chugging along and enjoying this nice talk about being awakened to God's love and the beauty in the world and the flowers. And I mean, isn't awakening from dreams such a pleasant experience? I mean, it's so nice. And then you say that one of the problems we have today is our unwillingness to be woke and to be awakened to the reality of systemic racism and injustice. And I thought we just did 90 degrees here. And this is going to reveal the culture in crisis of your book headline. And so I'm wondering if you could just give people a teaser about why it is that you took it in such a prophetic way and connected this archetypal universal desire for awakening as filtered through, the awakening that God wants to do in us spiritually, and say, therefore, to be a true evangelical with a renewed kingdom imagination is to be woke.
Yeah, why did I do that? That's a good question. No. Well, let me answer that in two ways. One, and this goes back to your earlier question about how can we begin to sort of see these things on our own beyond reading my book. This relationship between the words awakening and woke is a great example of how language works and how metaphor works, because a point I make in the book is that all language is metaphorical. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And I give a number of examples from a great book called Metaphors We Live By, where the authors go through and show how, like, even if I say, I'm going to run to the store, that's a metaphor. I'm not literally. My husband will say it every time. Why don't you take the car? Right? Or a river runs. Well, it doesn't really run. That's a metaphor. Our language is so filled with metaphors that we use so much that we actually don't recognize that they're metaphors. And this book, Metaphors We Live By, is a wonderful sort of awakening to that. And that word, awakening, I began with that because awakening is what precedes conversion, which is the next chapter and a central part of evangelicalism. And it is a universal cosmic symbol that we find everywhere. It's just part of what it means to be human. And you described it so nicely. And I literally do give a scene of flowers and birds and trees. Um, and so it's not accidental that this word awakening is central to the American evangelical experience for 300 years and is central to the call for racial justice in American culture today. It is not coincidence that being woke is connected to an awakening. And now, there is something called a genetic fallacy where you just say because the same word is used doesn't mean it's the same idea. And putting that aside, what really struck me in the past few years is how the word woke has been taken by people and used as a weapon and used to describe anything basically that might be of left-leaning or liberal or democratic. It's such a broad, to be anti-woke is to be anti all of those things, which takes a precious word that has been used in a very specific way among an oppressed people and turned into a weapon against them. And so that particular word and its connection to, an important word in evangelical history provided a perfect example to show how powerful language is, how important it is that we steward not only words well, but steward the souls that are using those words to cry out, and to use that word as a weapon against those who are crying out. It doesn't matter what we disagree about. We can disagree, but to use words as weapons in that way is anything but Christian.
I agree with you. And my heart aches for, just everyday Christians or pastors or ministry leaders who have done nothing but faithfully exegete the scriptures where God is calling for justice and said, I think we should focus on seeking justice in our society. And that means, engaging with this injustice. And their faithful engagement with the scriptures and their desire to embody that in their community all gets discredited by saying you're woke, and that attack destroys everything else that went before that, and it divides churches. It leads people to getting fired. It just halts right there the will of that community to get engaged in bringing justice to something. And I find it very mystifying that that we would want. I mean, I understand from reading the scriptures that this happens all the time, to use a prophet and use God's name to justify your situation and not be engaged with love of neighbor. I mean, we see that pattern throughout the scriptures, but it is so startling to see it in real time, I guess.
It is, and this is part of what I want to reclaim for evangelicalism, because the 18th and 19th century evangelicals were social reformers. In England in particular, they were abolitionists. Now, not all evangelicals were, but the leading voices were at the forefront of the abolition of the slave trade, at the forefront of educating the poor, of reforming labor laws, to cease the oppression of women and children and the poor. This is our heritage, and it's, the Bible is clear that we are to seek justice, but we just like to pick and choose the people that we want to give justice to. None of us are perfect, and we all have moral blind spots, but our goal should be explicitly and emphatically to pursue justice for all who are oppressed and weak and hungry and vulnerable, no matter their age or condition or race or place in our lives.
So another aspect of evangelical culture you identify is how we do testimonies. And testimonies are big business. And who doesn't love a good story of a wretch, in the muck and the mire of life, and there's a chance to go through all the grisly details, and then the light comes, and their soul is converted, and they're a new person, and now they're on the speaking circuit with a book, and they have a testimony, and how reassuring it feels that, wow, if God can save that person, maybe he can save my wayward son or daughter, or maybe he can handle, this situation or that situation. It gives hope, and it gives encouragement, and it inspires us. Like, look how much change God's done in that person's life. Maybe there could be that much change in my life. And so, I'm moved by these stories. We're all moved by these stories of dramatic transformation. But you kind of skillfully diagnose the ways in which we start to care more about the testimony and the spectacular than we do about the actual change. And when testimonies become a spectacle, they sell hope, but I think the other side of it is discouragement and despondency, because I look at my day today, and I had a conversation with some people that was very meaningful, but I'm not going to write a book about it. And I had lunch, and I took my kids to school, and now I'm having this conversation, So do I have a testimony for today? And compared to the spectacular ones, the Hollywood productions, I guess I don't. What has God done today? And so it's interesting how the spectacle actually, it's not it's like a fast food meal, and it doesn't give us hope for our daily lives. So as someone, I'm really focused on spiritual formation, so I wanted to come at it from that perspective and say, Karen, how do you find hope in your daily life? How do you find a testimony, if we can repackage that word and reimagine that word, of how God is at work in the little things of everyday life?
No, I love that question. And one of the points that I make in the book that I think the publisher made into like a meme is that, for the faithful Christian, our lives should be chock full of testimonies, right? Of every day. Just on a day when I know the fleshly Karen would respond in, anger or impatience, and I don't. There are times when I can literally feel that the Holy Spirit is working in me, helping me to be patient and kind and to not respond in my flesh. And that's not something I'm going to write a book about, but it is something that is like a testimony to me that day and how God is sanctifying me and with me and present with me. And so if we can draw our attention more to these things. Now, I teach literature. Of course, I love good stories. We all love good stories. This is part of what it means to be human. But we shouldn't, overlook the fact that, every salvation is the story of someone being dead in their sins and being risen to eternal life in Christ. That's everyone's story, and it doesn't get more dramatic than that. We all have that story if we are believers. And yet, as I said, every day can be full of testimonies of the way the Lord is refining and orchestrating. Sometimes this is going to sound like, I don't know if I want to say this, I'm going to say it, but I sometimes believe that God intervenes, like he is the God of my schedule. There are times when something will get canceled or something will be delayed, and it just opens up something in my whole day, and I feel like God did that. Like he knew what my schedule needed to be that day. And it just feels like a love letter from God. Now, I know people who don't believe would find that probably ridiculous, but I have a very personal relationship with the Lord. I feel that he is moving in my life in every day in every way. And to be in tune to that in those kinds of ways is to me a testimony of his work every day, and it's one I really treasure greatly. And again, doesn't make an exciting book, but I think if we are intentional about looking for those things and watching those things and being, as I said, in tune to them, we'll just see how he's working so much in our lives all the time against our old nature, and helping us to follow the way of Jesus.
I'll share a story that happened yesterday. I'd spent weeks preparing a position paper on a particular doctrine, and I'd thought to myself, what's the point of this work? How is this going to help anybody? Once it's done, it goes in a filing cabinet. I don't know why I've done this. And I lead a Sunday community at our church, and after we'd gotten going, a visitor came in who had never been there before, and I told her, welcome, and hey, by the way, if you have a question that's really on your heart, we could toss away our lesson and just talk about whatever's on your heart. And she said, really? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And she said, well, I want to talk about, and she mentioned the exact same issue that I'd spent all this time studying. And I just thought, this is a love letter from God. Like, this is so outside of any planning or agenda, but here's God just knitting together the question on her heart and what I've been laboring over. And those are moments where you go, that's uncanny. That speaks of just the work of the Holy Spirit. And so just being awake to those realities, I think, can bring us a lot of joy and encourage us. I want to go to maybe 30,000 or 50,000 feet, however high elevation you want to take us. What is modern culture? What does it mean to be in modernity? Because you keep going back and forth between here's modernity and here's the evangelical spin on modernity. So if you could just help people who are watching this, what is modernity?
I love this question, and I could talk about it all day. I'll try not to. So basically, anything that is ancient through the medieval and Renaissance periods would be considered pre-modern, and we usually mark what we call modernity with the Enlightenment, which is when the scientific revolution came in, and also another way of talking about it is what's called the turn to subjectivity, which means the turn from objective, transcendent truth, whether it's, from the medieval Christians or the Greeks and their Greek gods and the Romans and their Roman gods, all of the pre-modern religious beliefs of whatever kind look to objective outside sources. With the Enlightenment came this turn to the internal, the inner, the subjective experience. And even science, in a way, is that, because science is experimental. It's like saying, if I do this, what will happen? And I can measure and test it. And so modernity brought about this emphasis on, truth that we can know as individuals, as opposed to truth that is handed down to us from some godlike figure. That's the shortest definition of it. It's a tremendous shift. Probably the biggest shift in all of human history is from pre-modern to modern. And yet Christianity began, it began in the pre-modern period. It continues in modernity. But that's why when we look back in history, and Christianity might look so different to us in the first century church and in the medieval period than it does now, because these huge epics of human history create these cultures that we're part of, and so we will reflect those cultures. So all of the individualism, the expressivism, the subjectivity, the reliance on reason and rational rather than the mystical and the supernatural, those are all part of what it means to be modern, and we can't help but sort of interpret our understanding of Christianity through a modern lens.
That's awesome. And so now a question that I have on the back end of that is, so what's the solution? Do you want to go back and be pre-modern? Do we want to be postmodern? Do we want to be, biblical modern? I mean, what's our choice here? Like, okay, there's modernity and you're part of it, but do we just give up and be modern people who are Christian, or what do we do with that?
That's such a good question. I think, really this is so what my whole book is about. Is just saying half of the solution, or maybe 90% of the solution, is just recognizing that limitation, right? And again, that it's of God's design. He could have had us there in eternity with him now. And so to recognize, if we recognize, the way that modern people think and live differently than pre-modern, we can say, okay, so all right, so what remains true and consistent about Christianity that transcends pre-modern and modern? You mentioned postmodernity. I actually, this is, Christians have often been taught to fear postmodernity because they associate it with relativism. But there's one sense in which to be postmodern means to understand the limitations of modernity and kind of realize that, well, if modernity emphasizes reason and rationality and science, we know that Christianity is more than that. We know that science and reason and rationality can't explain the incarnation. They can't explain the crucifixion. And so we actually shouldn't want to be tied to modernity that we reject those things the way Thomas Jefferson did. He's like a true modern. So there are openings and possibilities that postmodernity can bring back to us about religious faith and experience. And to recognize that even that postmodernity or transhumanism or whatever is next, AI, I don't even want to think about that. All of those things are going to offer us challenges as human beings and believers. And it is always our call, whether we live in pre-modern times, modern or postmodern times, to understand the times, as the Bible tells us to, and to distinguish between what is cultural and what is biblical.
Yeah. So in a sense, you're just inviting us to not just automatically go with the flow, but to be aware of the flow and then to practice discernment and agency as we try and follow Jesus in the flow we're in.
I could have, if I had written that, it would have been a much shorter book, but that's the gist of it. Yes.
Okay. No, and I think that's why people need to read your book so they can look at all the different parts of the stream and gain that awareness. I mean, we're just scratching the surface of what's in your book. So here's maybe one of the most challenging questions I thought of, and if I need to retract it, that's okay. But you write, evangelicals and ex-evangelicals alike seem unable to resist the lure of selling Substack subscriptions, online courses, and personal coaching opportunities as a way to improve by being more or less evangelical, more or less Christian, and less or more something else. In such a culture, even in the church, it can be difficult to distinguish conversion from self-help, spiritual growth from worldly success, sanctification from self-improvement. But the converted person isn't merely new and improved, she is a new creature. And so here's where the question is hard. I mean, Karen, you're selling a Substack subscription. We're talking about your book. We'd like people to buy because it'll help them. I'm selling an online course right now. I think it's going to be super helpful for people. So is this hypocrisy? I mean, how do we distinguish between the evangelicalism represented by upstanding people like us and the grubby commerce of empire represented by everybody else?
Oh, that is such a good question. And that, but again, I keep coming back to this. A big part of it is asking the question, right? And so we are moderns. And so to be modern means that we have careers and jobs and we use technology and we have opportunities to speak and write. And so we're going to do those things. I mean, there are actually, of course, some, pockets of people who withdraw from those things and don't do those things, but most of us do those things. And so we are free to do those things, and God puts us in this culture, and so we can do those things. But I think my caution is to understand that they are those things, right? And they are not the ultimate thing. And it's so easy to confuse, like I said, self-improvement, getting in shape with being in a state of grace and having the kind of joy that only Christ can give. Like, there are no magical solutions or formulas, but we still get to live in this everyday life and fulfill vocations that, that serve our neighbors and serve our families and feed ourselves. And so those things are true for all times and all places, but none of us are going to have like something that can replace the gospel and something that can replace the Holy Spirit and something that can replace Christ on the cross.
That's really helpful. And I recently heard someone say that if someone's speaking about God things, but they keep pointing to themselves, that's a good diagnostic to watch out. But if they're talking about God things so that they can point you to God and empower you to be with God, even if you're no longer with them, then that might be something worth paying attention to. So, Karen, last question. What would be one of your hopes for after someone finishes your book? What's one thing you hope that they can take away with them when they close the last page and have completed reading your new book?
I hope that they can take away courage and inspiration in really just seeking Jesus, but at the same time realizing that we're in this culture, and that there's no escaping that, this side of heaven, and to just engage that, appreciate it, and yet be discerning so that we can let the cultural things be what they are, and let Jesus be what he is supposed to be for us.
That's awesome. Well, let me do the cultural thing. The book is The Evangelical Imagination, How Stories, Images, and Metaphor Created a Culture in Crisis. There will be a link to it under this video, so you can go straight to Amazon and get it. If you want to support a local bookseller, I can't link to them, but certainly encourage you to go do that as well. And there'll also be a link, Karen, to your Substack and your website so people can connect with you there. Thank you for giving me the space to learn from you today and giving all of us a space to just interact with you. And more than the research and the brilliance of your book, I'm grateful for the kindness of your heart. And it's been a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you, Carson.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, we have dozens of other deep dive interviews, and we'd love for you to come talk about it with us in the Uncommon Pursuit community. We'll see you again soon.